HPPodcraft.com.
Gorgons and hydras and chimeras, dire stories of Solano and the Harpies, may reproduce themselves in the brain of superstition, but they were there before. They are transcripts, types. The archetypes are in us and eternal. How else should the recital of that which we know in a waking sense to be false come to affect us at all? Is it that we naturally conceive terror from such objects considered in their capacity of being able to inflict upon us bodily injury? Oh, least of all. These terrors are of older standing. They date beyond body, or without the body they would have been the same. That the kind of fear here treated is purely spiritual, that it is strong in proportion as it is objectless on earth, that it predominates in the period of our sinless infancy, are difficulties the solution of which might afford some probable insight into our anti-mundane condition, and a peep, at least, into the shadowland of pre-existence. Charles Lamb, Witches and Other Night Fears.
Hello, I am Chad Fifer.
Yeah, and I'm Chris Lackey, and you're listening to the HP Lovecraft Literary Podcast.
You're at HPPodcraft.com. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you. It's wonderful to be back, but I'm not alone, Chad.
Are you serious? Who's with you?
I am with none other than Robert M. Price.
I thought it was Wilbur Whateley. There must be a mix-up.
No!
You do have a deep voice.
We're talking today about one of Lovecraft's most famous tales. We do talk about H.P. Lovecraft here, and the tale is the Dunwich Horror. Now, Robert is a leading Lovecraftian scholar, has been for some time. I believe you edited a journal called Crypt of Cthulhu, is that right?
Yeah, through 107 issues.
Whoa.
Wow. And you've been an essayist for a number of anthologies, and Robert is also professor of theology and scriptural studies at Coleman Theological Seminary and professor of biblical criticism at the Center for Inquiry Institute. And he's a co-host on this excellent podcast, Point of Inquiry, which everybody should check out, as well as his own show, The Bible Geek. We'll, of course, put up links to those shows on our page. Do you have any particular books on the market to call out or anything like that?
A couple of them appeared from Chaosium, a new anthology, The Yith Cycle, and then a new version of the Mysteries of the Worm, the Robert Bloch Mythos collection. And any time now they're supposed to be putting out the YogSothoth and the Yig cycles.
Mm-hmm.
And Mythos Books is supposed to be putting out the Exum cycle, which is tales revolving around the rats in the walls. So
wow.
I'm looking forward to those coming out eventually.
Now, I have a question for you, which I don't quite understand, is how you, as a theologian, got so heavily into Lovecraft.
I guess I got into HPL when I was in something like the 7th grade, and it hadn't been but a couple of years since I had become a teenage fundamentalist. I always thought that'd be a great movie title. I was a teenage fundamentalist. I didn't really find any real conflict, nor do I now, though I have to admit I'm not a conventional believer in any sense. I'm what I call a Christian atheist. I love the Episcopal Church and the ritual and the symbolism and all that stuff, but I have no real religious beliefs any longer.
Mm-hmm.
I study them but don't preach or anything.
Right.
So it's just one more system of mythology clothed in effective literature and very evocative. I mean, both the Bible and the Lovecraft and the other things I'm interested in, like Howard and comic books and so on.
Right.
They're all sort of mind-expanding, imagination-feeding texts, and I love them all.
Me too.
Me too. Well, hey, what can you guys tell me about that epigraph that we just heard? By the way, our reader today is once again the wonderful Andrew Lehman.
Yeah.
Who did that for us. And that was it was a Charles Lamb quote. What do we know about him? What did that mean?
The statement is very interesting, this idea of pre-existence of souls, and what's interesting about it is that it envisions some kind of hellish pre-existence, where usually people think of it as heavenly or even on the earth if it's reincarnation. But the idea that that's where we learn to fear what we fear but can no longer put a finger on it, that's a pretty spooky notion.
But there's
Gotcha.
also, in the passage, there's some kind of missing ellipses that Lovecraft doesn't include in this, when it's...
Oh, yeah, he cut some stuff out.
I think the line he cut out was, "Of course, this is all bullshit."
Yeah, that's correct. That is exactly what was cut out there. I'm looking at the... That's not it.
Charles Lamb actually has another famous epigraph, which was for To Kill a Mockingbird. It says, "Lawyers, I suppose, were children once." That's how that opens. So, if you want a successful piece of writing, I guess go find a Charles Lamb quote, stick it in there. It'll be the next Dunwich Horror, next To Kill a Mockingbird.
It'd be interesting if they both came from the same essay.
Yeah, it really would.
We don't have Bob for the whole run of the story.
Yeah, because this is a long story, and it'll probably have to break it up into a few parts. With that said, why don't we just dive into it?
When a traveler in north-central Massachusetts takes the wrong fork at the junction of the Aylesbury Pike just beyond Dean's Corners, he comes upon a lonely and curious country. The ground gets higher, and the briar-bordered stone walls press closer and closer against the ruts of the dusty, curving road. The trees of the frequent forest belt seem too large, and the wild weeds, brambles, and grasses attain a luxuriance not often found in settled regions. At the same time, the planted fields appear singularly few and barren, while the sparsely scattered houses wear a surprisingly uniform aspect of age, squalor, and dilapidation. Without knowing why, one hesitates to ask directions from the gnarled, solitary figures spied now and then on crumbling doorsteps or on the sloping, rock-strewn meadows. Those figures are so silent and furtive that one feels somehow confronted by forbidden things, with which it would be better to have nothing to do. When a rise in the road brings the mountains in view above the deep woods, the feeling of strange uneasiness is increased. The summits are too rounded and symmetrical to give a sense of comfort and naturalness, and sometimes the sky silhouettes with especial clearness the queer circles of tall stone pillars with which most of them are crowned. Across a covered bridge, one sees a small village huddled between the stream and the vertical slope of Round Mountain, and wonders at the cluster of rotting gambrel roofs bespeaking an earlier architectural period than that of the neighboring region. It is not reassuring to see on a closer glance that most of the houses are deserted and falling to ruin, and that the broken steepled church now harbors the one slovenly mercantile establishment of the hamlet. One dreads to trust the tenebrous tunnel of the bridge, yet there is no way to avoid it. Once across, it is hard to prevent the impression of a faint malign odor about the village street, as of the massed mold and decay of centuries. It is always a relief to get clear of the place and to follow the narrow road around the base of the hills and across the level country beyond till it rejoins the Aylesbury Pike. Afterward, one sometimes learns that one has been through Dunwich.
And those are the opening paragraphs, or two selections from the first few paragraphs of the Dunwich Horror. Lovecraft doing an excellent job of creating a setting.
Yeah, now, let's talk about Dunwich a bit. Now, there is a bit of controversy of how it's pronounced.
Right. We talked about that previously.
Yeah, we did. Now, people from England, there is actually, or was a Dunwich in England, and it was pronounced Dunwich. And there are places in Massachusetts which are, even there's a Greenwich, which is pronounced Greenwich, and Ipswich.
Right. Oh, it's pronounced in Massachusetts, it's Greenwich?
Yeah.
They don't say
it's
Greenwich?
Actually Greenwich. It's not Greenwich. So in Massachusetts, it seems to be with a W in there. But even if you go over to Rhode Island, they say itch. They don't say which. So, and Lovecraft has never said which way it was supposed to be pronounced.
Well, if it's in Massachusetts, I would go with a witch.
Exactly.
Plus, if you say Dunwich, people are going to think, what a jerk. You got to be that right.
You're right. Yes.
Take that, Chris.
I know, because I was the guy that said Dunwich last week. And I was like, oh, Chad, it's Dunwich. But I did a little research and found out that it's nobody knows. Also, the thing about the Dunwich in England was that it's gone. It sort of got eaten up by the sea, and it seems a lot more similar to actually Innsmouth, which is another town that Lovecraft's going to talk about. There's a lot more parallels between Innsmouth and
the Dunwich there.
Yeah, the Dunwich that was in England. Also, Arthur Mackin mentioned the English Dunwich in one of his stories, The Terror.
Oh, really?
Yeah, we know that Arthur Mackin is a big influence on this particular story.
Yeah, a real big one.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, he even later on, he cites the great god Pan in the story.
But Bob, I think you've written actually that this is more or less a pastiche of a lot of Mackin's stories, specifically the great god Pan.
Yeah, if it weren't so well done, people would be jeering at it as they do Derleth's The Shuttered Room, saying, oh, come on, this is just a rip-off of Shadow over Innsmouth and Dunwich Horror. Well, it sort of is, but it's got a certain charm of its own. But in this case, you really have to do a double take to realize the amazing degree to which this is based on Mackin. He really has made it his own, but it is an added dimension to realize where it comes from, especially Helen Vaughn and the spawn of Pan.
Yeah, because in the story, the great god Pan, the god or the interdimensional being or whatever you want to call it, mates with a woman, and the story is about the offspring who is supernatural and causes all these problems. It's a really cool story. If you haven't, the audience hasn't read The Great God Pan, check it out. It's really neat. It's really creepy.
Yeah, it's good stuff. Now, after those first few paragraphs, Lovecraft goes on to say that even though on the surface the scenery is beautiful around Dunwich, people generally avoid it. And they did 2 centuries ago during the witch panic, but now they do it as a result of something that happened as recently as 1928, which is referred to as the Dunwich Horror. Now, the story was written in 1928, I believe.
Yeah.
And was it published soon after?
It was published. It was published in Weird Tales, and this is at this point, it was the biggest payment that Lovecraft ever got for a story, which is $240, which is a heck of a lot. I mean, if we were talking about, remember, he only got paid $16 for
the last test.
Yeah, the last test.
The people who live in Dunwich, because of their isolation from the rest of the world, and this is a pretty common theme about these backwoods New England places, they've sort of succumbed to inbreeding and decadence. The old families of the Whateleys and the Bishops, these are the sort of old families there. They'll still send some of their kids off to Harvard and Miskatonic University, but those kids, once they get away to college, they don't want to come back to Dunwich.
Don't want any part of it.
And most people, when they go to college, they have to sort of adjust to the wider world, but imagine if you were from Dunwich, Wait, you're telling me you date outside of your family? College is crazy.
What are those things you're wearing on your feet?
Exactly. Now, something's wrong with Dunwich, and it says maybe it's from the Indians who were there before and called out things from the hills and caused these rumblings in the earth. In 1747, the Reverend Abijah Whateley, is it Abijah?
I think it's Abijah or Abijah.
He'd come to Dunwich Village Congregational Church and gave a whole sermon on this, where he said he'd been hearing demons speaking in the hills behind his house, a rattling and rolling, a groaning, screeching, and hissing, and then he disappeared shortly after giving the sermon.
Yeah.
Is this fella based on anybody? Was he a real guy?
No, he's totally fictional.
Well, what he recorded isn't uncommon. Around Dunwich, people talk about airy things passing by them from the ravines, strange odors from those stone pillars on the top of the mountains, and they sort of have a blasted heath there as well, or a blasted hillside.
Yeah, it's very similar. It was making me think of, call it a Devil's Hop Yard, and a hop yard is where they would grow hop.
The Devil's Hop Yard is that's a band name if I've ever heard one. Now, that's a state park up in Connecticut or something.
This thing with the rushing, airy presences, the stench and all that you're supposed to coordinate with the Necronomicon quote later on. As of foulness shall ye know them and all that. That's the old ones that this guy is aware of, though he doesn't know to call them that. Mm-hmm. And they're in the places where the rites have been howled in their season and so on. It's only Armitage eventually who'll make the connection.
Yeah, and there's also this local legend about Whippoorwills.
Yeah, that's right. A real legend too of the area. Lovecraft, back in 28, he went to go visit the area in the summer of 28, and he was staying with a friend or visiting a friend. I don't know if he actually stayed with her. Edith Miniter, and that was in Wilbraham.
When you say the area, you mean this was he actually based this off an area?
He did. He based it off this area in south central Massachusetts, even though he said it's in northern Massachusetts. And it was his stay in this area. And this is a letter to, I think it was his Aunt Lillian. He says about this area, the scenery is lovely in the extreme, with just the right balance of hill and plain. It is not so vivid as Vermont, but much richer and statelier, with larger trees and more luxuriant vegetation generally. The houses are old, but not notable. The population is quite sharply divided. The good families are maintaining their old standards, whilst the common folk are going downhill. And on this trip, that's where he heard the story of the Whippoorwills.
What is that story, Bob? Do you know?
Yeah, that when somebody dies, the Whippoorwills wait around to catch his soul and devour it somehow, and that they're psychopomps, that they carry it off to the next world or somewhere. And there's a lot of old legends all over the world that that departing souls turn into birds or sound like them or one thing or another. But this is just the straight story he was told when he was there.
Psychopomps.
Well, psychopomp is a Greek word. It means a conductor of souls. Yeah.
Hermes was supposed to be that kind of like the Grim Reaper or Charon on the River Styx.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. And just for our listeners, if you haven't heard what a whippoorwill sounds like, check this out.
Wow, I feel a little lighter. I hope it didn't take my soul. It's kind of nice, actually. Well, we end this first chapter of the story by saying that Dunwich is, it says, ridiculously old, which I think is a great description. The most modern piece of architecture there is from 1806, which, that is quite a while ago. The stone circles on the hills are the oldest, said to be from the Indians, but deposits of skulls and bones that have been found there, some ethnologists believe that the remains may be Caucasian. Dun, dun, dun. So I don't know. Yeah, a bunch of white folks have been killed up there. So that's the end of that first chapter. We get into the second chapter where we have a very significant incident that sort of sparks the whole story.
It was in the township of Dunwich, in a large and partly inhabited farmhouse set against a hillside 4 miles from the village and 1.5 miles from any other dwelling, that Wilbur Whateley was born at 5 a.m. on Sunday, the 2nd of February, 1913. This date was recalled because it was Candlemas, which people in Dunwich curiously observe under another name, and because the noises in the hills had sounded and all the dogs of the countryside had barked persistently throughout the night before. Less worthy of notice was the fact that the mother was one of the decadent Whateleys, a somewhat deformed, unattractive albino woman of 35, living with an aged and half-insane father about whom the most frightful tales of wizardry had been whispered in his youth. Lavinia Whateley had no known husband, but according to the custom of the region made no attempt to disavow the child, concerning the other side of whose ancestry the country folk might, and did, speculate as widely as they chose. On the contrary, she seemed strangely proud of the dark, goatish-looking infant who formed such a contrast to her own sickly and pink-eyed albinism, and was heard to mutter many curious prophecies about its unusual powers and tremendous future.
We're getting rolling here with a virgin birth, right?
Yeah, Stan Sargent, who wrote an interesting sequel to the Dunwich Horror, kind of unraveling it and challenging the surface perspective of it, called what did I just say this? I forget now. Black Brat of Dunwich. It's very interesting, and he points out the obvious that she must have been impregnated by her father, and that he was the vessel somehow for this. Which makes the whole thing even more disgusting, and that's why the invisible twin later on has this half face that looks like old wizard Whateley, because it's actually his bastard spawn.
Well, I didn't make that connection when I read it. I just assumed that some slimy monster came down and she got with that. But
no, it makes sense though.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nauseating stuff.
Now, I had all kinds of theories about the relationship of Jesus Christ to Joseph Kerwin when we did the case of Charles Dexter Ward, but those all hit the cutting room floor, and we never got them into the show. But is this story related to that at all, do you think? I mean, is he playing on some Christian legendary, or would he just say no?
Yeah. Especially when he has the invisible twin up there on the Sentinel Hill, which is like Golgotha, and he's croaking out Father. It's like Jesus on the cross. Yeah. And Don Burleson and others have pointed this out. And he says that really there's even the resurrection idea, because it's obvious that Wilbur and the twin share an actantial role, as critics call it. They're different characters, obviously, but they're the same narrative function personified. It's almost as if they are the same character. And so you have Wilbur get mauled by the German Shepherd, and he dissolves, and then suddenly the twin bursts out of the house as if it was the empty tomb, and then, however, as Don would say, he's deconstructing the thing so that his crucifixion occurs after the resurrection, which is pretty much what happens in the Last Temptation of Christ too, interestingly. But I think it's just it's got a lot of Jesus analogies in there.
Our Mother Mary figure, Lavinia, we learn a little bit about her in the second chapter. We learn that she likes to wander around in thunderstorms. She read the old book the Whateleys kept. And now, the old Whateley, the dad, he was some kind of black magician of repute around Dunwich. Yeah. And we know that her mother had died by some sort of violence when Lavinia was 12. Mm-hmm. That's all anybody knows. And, they live like hoarders out there. It's a big mess where they live, and Lavinia has crazy ideas, and she's a little deformed. Now, nobody presided over the birth. In fact, people only found out a week later that she'd even had this child when old Whateley came down talking somewhat incoherently at the general store, which is the setting of a lot of fun conversations in the store.
Yeah. I don't care what folks think. If Lavinia's boy looked like his pa, he wouldn't look like nothing you expect. You needn't think the only folks is the folks hereabouts. Lavinia's read some and has seed some things the most you only tell about. I calculate her man is as good a husband as you can find this side of Aylesbury. And if ye knowed as much about the hills as I do, you wouldn't ask no better church wedding a hern. Let me tell you something. Someday you folks'll hear a child of Lavinia's a-calling its father's name on the top of Sentinel Hill.
You remember what Sam Jaffe says as Wizard Whateley in the movie? And then you'll know. That's a great addition. That's chilling.
Now, is that the 1970 film? Yeah. I haven't seen that. Have you seen that, Chris?
I have not. It's hard to get a copy of it, actually. I've been looking around for one, and it wasn't on Netflix when I was living in the States, and it's even harder to find over here.
Dean Stockwell's in it.
Oh, he's great, yeah.
He's also in the one they just did on the Sci-Fi Channel.
Is this the one with Jeffrey Combs as Wilbur?
That's right, yeah. I didn't see that one either, but I think it's funny that Dean Stockwell's been in the Dunwich Horror twice.
I forgot that he was in the new one. I saw that at the Lovecraft Flick Fest in Portland. I thought it was, they had good people in it, but what a waste. I actually prefer the Dean Stockwell version.
I love the general store setting. I just imagine there's a couple of old guys out there playing checkers, eating, pickles. And Whateley runs up and says this, and they're like, "What? Okay." But it is an efficient quote. What old Whateley says here. He tells us that the pa is something weird looking. It's not one of the folks from Dunwich, and that someday, as Bob had said earlier, a child of Lavinia's is going to call the father's name on the hilltop. And I guess we're all going to find out who Dad is when that happens.
Oh, may I just add one thing about the general store scene?
Sure thing.
I would swear that is consciously based on the madman scene in Nietzsche's The Gay Science. I did a Cthulhu prayer breakfast sermon on this some years ago, where the madman bursts into town. He's the object of ridicule. He says, "I seek God, I seek God," and people start ridiculing him. He has a lit lamp. It's daytime. He smashes the lamp and he says, "God is dead and we have killed him. What can we do? We must become gods to become worthy of this." And everybody's blank faced, and he says, "I see I've come too early. From a distant star, light even takes a long time to arrive." And it's the real premier statement of Nietzsche's death of God view, and of course Lovecraft's largely Nietzschean. I'm sure that is the origin of that scene.
Very cool. Well, after that, nobody sees the baby for that first month except some townies who are curious.
Well, and another thing, Chad, is when he comes in, he starts ordering cattle.
Right. And Zechariah, who's a relative of theirs, he brings some cows over that old Whateley bought, and that's the reason that we find out about the cows. Now, what is the deal with the cows?
Well, he just keeps ordering more cows, and then he has some cows that are around, more cows than what should be around, but they're sort of sickly, and they've got these little sores and kind of cuts on them, and they're the same sores and cuts that have been seen on Wizard Whateley and on Lavinia. Like there's these little open, weird cut sores that have been showing up on them since the birth of Wilbur.
Though isn't it implied that it's the unknown twin that is the vampire sucking the life out of the cows and the people?
Well, pretty soon Lavinia's out rambling around with her baby, but the baby is growing up really fast. This Wilbur, he starts walking at like 7 months, which is crazy. I mean, when does a baby typically walk? At least
about a year.
Well, that's because they're not feeding them beef early enough. In his case,
a little after he does start walking, Silas Bishop, who's another guy in the town who's not inbred and crazy, he sees Wilbur and his mother running up Sentinel Hill. He thinks naked around Halloween. Well, Wilbur's got some kind of belt. And shortly after, he sees a fire burning around the stones at the top.
That's right out of The Great God Pan, too.
Yeah.
The girl's out playing in the woods, you mean that?
Yeah, and the guy rounding up the sheep or the cattle or something notices and says, what's going on there? It's right out of Mackin.
And it's remarkable that Wilbur is, at this point, in any state of undress, because as he grows older, he always wears long sleeves, all buttoned up, and he gets really angry if any of his clothing is out of order. He's sort of like, he dresses like David Lynch, I think, a little bit. Right? Isn't he always buttoned up?
Yeah, he always has the top button.
Yeah. So that's a weird thing about him. I don't know why he does that.
And he starts speaking like an adult. He doesn't have a lisp like a little kid would have. He's got a good vocabulary, and he's just generally creepy. And he looks like a goat. He's goatish.
Yeah, he's got a goatish. Yeah, you're right. At 11 months, he's talking, and when he does talk, there's something unearthly about it. It's almost like he's producing sound with different organs than other people do.
That's very much like the guy, I can't think of his name, the lead singer in Creedence Clearwater Revival.
Exactly like that.
Oh, man. It does say already here, all conjectures about Wilbur were spiced with references to the bygone magic of old Whateley and how the hills once shook when he shrieked the dreadful name of YogSothoth in the midst of a circle of stones with a great book open in his arms before him. So, reference already to this entity, YogSothoth, which we saw before in Charles Dexter Ward. It was part of the spell for calling up and calling down the dead, but what is YogSothoth? I still don't really, I'm not real clear on what it is or if we know that.
An interdimensional, like the psychopomp thing in a sense, only he's the key and the guardian of the gate. He is the gate. It's like he's sort of a interdimensional portal, and yet a being whose likeness earthlings can bear. It doesn't say he's one of the old ones. The old ones appear to be more of a concrete race of things that look like the twin once you can see him briefly. That's one point the 1970 Dunwich Horror movie makes. They had no budget, and so when you see the old ones, there's just a bunch of body painted hippies, and it looks stupid, but it does suggest from somebody's fresh reading of the story, they're just talking about aliens from another dimension, not transcendent gods, as we sometimes say in the wake of Dirk Mosig. And but YogSothoth appears to be some sort of function of the design of the cosmos. Mike Sisko doped out the meaning of the name as meaning something like son of the Strangler, which was an epithet of the devil. We don't know if Lovecraft knew enough Arabic or had read this anywhere, but it's possible that that's what it means.
Oh, wow. Son of the Strangler.
It's often depicted as being made up of a lot of spheres, like being kind of like a bunch of different spheres. But Lovecraft actually gives another description of it in one of his letters. He says, Yog doesn't always have long, ropey arms, since he assumes a variety of shapes, solid, liquid, gaseous, at will. Possibly, though, his fondest of the form which does have them.
He's fondest of having the arms.
The ropey arms and the
like he knows him. It's also noted here in the second chapter that dogs hate Wilbur Whateley. They just hate him. And he has to be very careful when he's around dogs. So we have the setting and we have the character, and that brings us into chapter 3, which really begins plot. This is where story begins. We learn that old Whateley had immediately begun fixing up the house when Wilbur was born. And he also fixes up a tool shed outside and puts a lock on it. And while he's got the lock on that tool shed, the second floor of the house, he boards up the windows so that nobody can see in there. He makes a room for Wilbur on the ground floor, and he fills it with shelves, and all the old books that he has, he puts up there for Wilbur to read and study. It's going to be his school. It's going to be all of his learning. Wilbur is continuing to grow up fast. By a year and 7 months, he's a fluent talker. He looks like he's 4. He's running around the fields and hills with his mom, and he's studying the books at home. So he can already read.
Yeah.
When the restoration of the house is done, the lock barn is no longer locked. The door just swings open. But now there's a really strange architectural feature on the house. There's a door on the second floor of the house where there once was a window with a ramp going up to it from the hill.
And Earl Sawyer, one of the locals, goes over and he actually went inside, and it smells weird. And there's this specific odor that keeps kind of coming up in the story where he describes a very specific that smells like thunder.
Does that mean ozone, you think?
I guess so.
There's also, rumblings underground and fires in the hills all this time of his youth, which people are attributing to them. Now, by the time Wilbur is 4, he looks like he's 10, and I love this. He's totally packing heat. Like this little kid, because dogs hate him so much, he's got to carry a pistol as he wanders around. And so it says sometimes he uses it.
Yeah.
Which means this 4-year-old kid is walking around shooting dogs. I don't know. It just seems like they should have Earl Sawyer come home and say, honey, that 4-year-old down the street just shot a dog. We gotta stop this kid.
That 4-year-old who looks like a 10-year-old.
He's not talking so much anymore, though. He chants to himself a little bit sometimes, but Wilbur's sort of quietly evil. Now, the very few people who come up, they find Lavinia alone on the ground floor, often at home. But they'll hear crazy noises upstairs in the boarded up
sloshing
floor.
Around, something that's sloshing.
But people whisper that maybe they're sacrificing cows up there or something like that, because the cows are, they never have them in inventory. They keep ordering them, but they're never around. And, in fact, the Great War breaks out in 1917, and the draft board can't find enough fit Dunwich men because they're all inbred and weird to make their quota. Reporters from Boston and Arkham come to check it out. I love that it's Boston and Arkham. Like before in the story, they said they sent the students to Harvard and Miskatonic. It's that same thing where they're blending the actual real places with Lovecraft Country.
He says the Arkham Advisor, which is a change-up, because last time that he talked about it in The Color Out of Space, it was the Arkham Gazette. From now on, every time he mentions the Arkham newspaper, it's the Arkham Advisor.
So there was some kind of Arkham publishing war. And
I guess so.
Could be.
And that's it for this week's episode, part 1 of the Dunwich Horror. We realized that the story is actually about a publishing war. Fascinating stuff. I want to thank Robert M. Price for joining us on the show, and also Chad Fifer for being my co-host. Chad, you did a great job. I thought we did a sententious job. All right. I also want to thank Andrew Lehman for his outstanding reading. Always a pleasure having him on the show. Next week, we will be back with part 2 of the Dunwich Horror.
HPPodcraft.com.